is I researched how to talk about mental health in a way that it increases people's knowledge on how to approach it and what to do about it. And I was working from a biopsychosocial perspective, which is quite a mouthful to say, but really when we break it down, it just hopefully gonna make common sense. So I put together a few slides to try to illustrate that. So biopsychosocial is basically an amalgamation of words of biological, psychological, and social. So let's go through those. First of all, the biology in biopsychosocial, I thought we can think about ourselves as though we all have 3 bodies. And this is not to create an artificial divide, but rather to provide enough space so that we can have our invisible processes, intangible processes that can be quite abstract and beyond words. And often they are a lot harder to communicate about, which means that often they are not taken as seriously as they need to be taken. So the biology in biopsychosocial is, for example, your physical body. And part of mental health is the physical body prepares a stress response so we can fight, flight, or freeze when we have a threat coming towards us. And this is a biological ingrained response that can lead to a number of biological physical changes. So for example, on the bottom of the screen, you can see that when we have this stress response kicking in, we may have our breathing quickening because more oxygen can go to the muscles. We can, for example, run and fight faster. But what may also happen through that, as much as this is adaptive, is we may get a bit dizzy because of the breathing and heart rate changes. We may also have some chest pain or shortness of breath as well. So some of the very adaptive processes actually can have side effects which can feel pretty uncomfortable. So that's the physical body. And it's very important to know with neurodiversity that we don't all actually have the same physical body. So it's all assumed that we are all the same on the inside, but that is not true. Biological sensitivity to stress is a very real thing. And some people have lower or higher sensitivity to stress, which they can feel in their body. That can be dependent on many different factors. I just want to talk a bit about what it looks like. So let's imagine that we have a graph when on the left, imagine that these traffic lights are talking about how high the stress is. So the green is okay, the yellow is medium, the red is really high. And on the bottom of the graph, we have the time. So imagine that first there is a person who has a biological low stress sensitivity. They are walking in the park, they are doing okay. Their baseline, which is their, I guess, normal everyday way, is pretty low. We are in the green area. But then suddenly they see something that looks like a snake. So that way the stress spikes up quite a bit. But if they realize that it's actually not a snake, it's just a stick that looks like a snake, the anxiety and stress can calm down and people can go by their days, back to their baseline, back to their norm, don't think anything more about it. However, when we come to a person who has more of a high stress sensitivity, they often don't even start in the okay baseline. I don't know if any of you had these feelings that you just wake up in the morning and something is already a bit offish. So some people already start at the mildly stressed version, even at the beginning of their day. And so if they were to see something that looks like a snake, often the stress response kicks in a lot faster and it goes a lot higher. So you get to the red zone, the severe zone, a lot faster. And what's more is that even after we notice that it's not a snake, it's a stick, it's harmless, it can take a long, long time to actually calm down. So even when you're realizing that there is no threat, it can take a while for your body to regulate itself. And that is based on biology. So if you look at these two graphs, we can see that somebody with a genetically or environmentally lower stress sensitivity would be able to weather stress biologically a lot differently from someone who has a high stress responsivity. So this is a biological part of our body. And if we go to the psychological part, we can imagine that we also have an inner body for our inner experiences. And this is where our thoughts, feelings, urges, and inner experiences live. And this is something that we often don't see. They are hard to talk about, they are hard to verbalize, and they are very difficult for others to see because these are often invisible processes. So thoughts might be a lot of questions, black and white thinking, getting distracted, having racing thoughts, or feelings might be you're flooded with emotions, feeling disconnected or feeling very connected. Urges may be to be impulsive, to procrastinate, to reach out and connect, or to withdraw from others. But whatever you feel, think, and urges you have may all be invisible for others. So moving on to the third body, this is the social body, which is what others can actually see. Now, the trick with this is what others can see is not necessarily how we really feel and what really is going on for us. So there are a number of things that can really influence the way we express our inner world. And some of these things are what we see others do. So often we just mimic other people's behaviors that tend to be, this is just what we do when we feel a certain way. It can also be influenced by what other people have taught you about how to express yourself. So often if you were told to smile, you may have a tendency to smile and mask your feelings, even though you don't feel like smiling or you're not happy. It's also influenced by what works in a situation. So even if you're really upset and you feel like crying and you have a presentation, you may not want to cry during the presentation, although you can't avoid it all the time, but it may be more effective to cry once the presentation is over and you have people to comfort you. Expressions can also be dependent on how your body responds. So briefly, we talked about the fight, flight, or freeze. That means that if we get stressed, sometimes the biology is so strong that we don't have control over what we're going to do and how we're going to express ourselves. And last but not least, expressions and what others can see can also depend on your culture. So there are really strongly culturally accepted and discouraged ways of expressing yourself. And it also depends on your natural wiring. So for example, when we talk about happiness or excitement, some people might be jumping up and down with a massive smile on their face. Some people might be quite blank with expression. And as an autistic woman, often my happy face is exactly the same as my sad face, and that can be very confusing for people. And last but not least, when we talk about the social in biopsychosocial, even if we say that we have these three bodies, which is the biological physical body, the psychological inner world, and the social body that others can see, we don't actually live in a vacuum. And that's a very, very important facet of mental health, to understand that mental health is not an individual issue. So the social in biopsychosocial is also about the environment or context, which is the world around you, all the things that are happening in the world that are influencing you. So I just put the three bodies in the middle as an example, but if you look at it, it can be the whole world, global warming, politics, the social and economical state of your country in which you live, natural disasters, the pandemic, how you access or don't have access to medical care, how you have access or no access to basic necessities like nutrition and food. It can be also all the environmental barriers and injustices. So we are talking about racism, discrimination, and a lot of biases that can really prevent people from doing the best that they can do. Lack of access to money or financial insecurity, difficulties with housing or the support system that we have, these have all a massive impact on our mental health. So the biggest thing that I always want to hone in with the biopsychosocial theory is that we cannot take ourselves out of the bigger environment. So the social part is just as important as the individual part. So this was my introduction to the biopsychosocial theory. And there will be a Q&A, so if there are any questions, I'll be very happy to hear about it. But I'm just gonna throw the first question over to the panel, which is, how is mental health perceived in your region? And what is the impact of that perception? Perpetua, would you mind starting us off?
Okay, I've unmuted myself, so I said, of course. So in my country, quite where I live in Singapore right now, mental health is still pretty young. And quite often, I think one problem with how mental health is perceived is how people with difficult non-compliant behavior, people who have done sometimes things that are associated with more of antisocial personality disorder, they tend to be immediately sent to the psychiatric hospital, and the reports will say this person was depressed or anxious, which then gives mental health a bad name, because we know that at least once in our lives, all of us will go through an episode of what feels like anxiety or depression. And so when we are seeing all this, immediately people will construe anxiety and depression instantly with mad. And so it's almost like there are two groups of people, and whatever we are feeling, being human and the whole, like roller coaster of emotions and mental health challenges, that whole journey is basically just not honored. And at the same time, what I want to also say is that there are some support and resources available in the community in therapy clinics and hospitals, etc. But I think that generally from where I'm watching, and let's also put in mind a caveat that I'm watching from the lens of somebody who's been abroad from 10 years and then came back quite recently. So what I'm seeing is that the stigma and awareness of access may be a bigger issue, where people just think that, okay, I'm stressed, or they just conflate it there, or people deny that they are stressed. They just think that it's normal to burn out, work many, many hours, and that unhealthy escape behaviors are okay because everybody is doing that. And then on the other hand, people who have been accessing mental health in my region, some of them tell me that they've been going to therapy and talking for many, many years with very little change. So that doesn't quite help the issue if this is what's being propagated upwards to people who are curious. And so, I think generally over here, mental health is seen as something that is associated with mental health difficulties or mental health disorders or diagnosis, rather than something that should be honored, like our emotional health and our physical health.
Yeah, very good points. Thank you so much for this thorough introduction. What about you, MP? What have you noticed about how mental health is perceived in your region?
Thank you, Lutza, and thank you, Dr. P, for introducing this whole idea of mental health in APAC region. Because, similar to your experience, Dr. P, that's in a similar fashion how it is in India. Mental health is still, there's a lot of stigma associated to it. But then I would say we can actually see a range of perception, a range of how people see mental health as. Like if we look at it from a developmental perspective, we can see that especially the Gen Z and Alpha generation, and all these younger generations which are below Gen Z, they are quite open to talk, not only just talk about, they are aware, they have more access to information, especially through social media. I mean, in that ways, I think it's a boon that social media has provided them with not only the options to explore channels of information, but also help them with strategies that one can use at home in their everyday life. Of course, that poses another set of challenges because they are still kids in certain ways, and then the whole cyber crime, and then these all these numbers that we are quite fascinated with now with because of social media. It's like even if you are not really interested in math, there's something that you would be really interested in looking at checking out your notifications. So that adds on to the further the pressure to behave and to be in a certain way. Now, the other, there's this middle segment that I, usually interact with, which are the parents of these individuals, these children that I'm quoting them as children, though some of them are, above 18 years as well. But then these so-called parents and these, millennial generation and a little above that, with them, yes, I've seen that they're quite open in that fashion. They are aware that there are challenges and there is something that they can do, like they have the responsibility to make their life better, their kids' life better, their colleagues' life better. But then there is still hesitance when it comes to really executing that part. It's like really bringing a change which requires us to change first. That's still something that I've observed that they struggle with. And then comes all the older generations, and there are like so much stigma because they have had their own life in a certain fashion, and things are changing at such a fast pace that even for that matter, like my grandparents are alive, so my son has his great grandparents with him, and there is this whole the way we are a millennial generation is raising their kids is quite different from how they did it at their time. So there is a lot of not just difference with respect to how they see mental health as, but also the importance of how you want to develop the next generation. So I think what I want to encapsulate is that not only there are differences, there's stigma, but then there is hope, especially to, I mean, I don't know, in a way, thanks to pandemic, there's a boom in the mental health organizations, these, online platforms that we have now, and, so much, a lot of people are available. So in that sense, the professionals are available, at just the fingertips, and not so good things. I hope that would make sense. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for highlighting the generational differences as well, because they are very important. And I think generational differences, gender differences, even differences between how neurotypical and neurodistinct people perceive mental health is absolutely massive. And going back to Perpetua's point, it's so true that mental health is often talked about in a way of mental illness. So we are not really putting a positive spin on health and mental fitness. We are talking about something is wrong and something needs to be fixed. And my experience in Australia is that we are making absolutely great strides with increasing mental health awareness on the community level. And we have a lot more initiatives which are driven by more grassroots organizations. For example, there's this brilliant organization called Trademats, who are a bunch of tradies, and they advocate for mental health around tradesmen. And that's a wonderful initiative. But this is more the exception and the new trend which we want to grab hold of, because at the same time, the general perception of mental health is that this is something that is the professionals' territory. So if you have, for example, a mental illness, or if you have any mental health issues, then supposedly you should see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And then whoever you see as a mental health provider, a social worker will look at, for example, your surroundings and relationships and the way you live and housing and the rest of it, which is super important. A psychiatrist might look at medications, which also can be very useful. And psychologists often look at the way we think, feel, and behave. Again, very useful. But what's also missing is that we can't actually be segmented into these 3 different bodies and have only parts of us being taken care of. We need a lot more holistic care. And what's more, we need a lot more community care, so that we don't see as, oh, if somebody's feeling down, if somebody is really anxious, then we can't do anything. It's off to a professional to deal with. I think, and this is, I guess, part of the next questions, just opening up with what changes are needed to manage mental health better in the region. I think in Australia, there's a lot of initiatives for awareness raising. At the same time, the resources need to follow it. So even if we have a lot of campaigns asking people to reach out and destigmatizing reaching out, unless we have someone to answer the calls when people reach out, really it's about awareness of having to reach out, which often can be very disheartening for people who find it so hard to reach out. They finally get the courage up to trust someone with what's going on for them, and a disheartening response, lack of support then can really cut very deep. So we need to make sure that we don't just raise awareness of your responsibility to reach out, we also back it up with services and resources, so when somebody is asking for help, they are supported. And the second thing in that question is, I'm really keen on increasing mental health literacy in the community. So mental health literacy is the knowledge about the skills and behaviors that can improve, keep, and treat good mental health in yourself and other people. So if we all know more about how to manage mental health in our lives, then we don't have to feel like if someone is in trouble, if they're going through a really hard time, then they must go and see a psychologist because we have nothing to give. We all have a lot to give. So on this question of what changes are needed to improve mental health in your regions, what would be your suggestions, Perpetua?
I really love this, Lutza, because I think this is so important. Like you said, just because we know things doesn't mean we can access them or know that it's okay to access them. So I think for me, one of the most important things I've been harping about, just not just in my region, but internationally, is that mental health needs to be rebranded. So we need to see that in terms of a spectrum. Like, you don't go from mentally fit overnight to having a diagnosis, nor do you recover overnight. Sometimes people are just so impatient, thinking that I just need this magic bullet, this magic pill, and everything's going to be fabulous. No. And I mean, And this is no respect to say things like sports or astrology, but people often know things like how, say, a Cancerian is wired, or how, or even your MBTI, your 4-alphabet thingy is, how to decode that, how, what's the vital stats of a sports person, but we don't know how our brains are wired. We don't know what we are made of, like our DNA, our biology. And that is actually something that we need some basic understanding about, just like counting money, or learning how to tell the time. So when it comes to mental health and mental fitness, it's really important to understand that it's across the spectrum. Like, you're mentally fit, and then there's what Adam Grant calls languishing or meh, and then there's not quite okay, and then there's that part where we are definitely burnt out or needing a diagnosis, and that we traverse across the spectrum. It's okay, and yes, it's possible to be mentally fit rather than just be thinking about stress and burnout as normal, because yes, they are not commonplace, but that doesn't mean they should be acceptable. So for instance, especially during the pandemics, Terry Cole has talked about this. She says that what if the burnout during a pandemic is really a boundaries issue? So especially in Asia. Okay, so one thing I would say with my clients and with the people I'm watching is that if you're not willing to assert your boundaries gracefully, then nobody knows what they are. So you're definitely going to be expected to work nonstop, because you're not saying that you're tired, right? You're saying that it's okay to be on call 24/7, and so you'll be under receiving and over giving. So it's our onus in terms of mental health to be able to speak about boundaries. And then, of course, like back to that whole thing about mental fitness, is that to talk about and exemplify how we need to take care of our brains the way we know how to take care of our teeth, or when we have a cut. So this is what Guy Winch talks a lot about. So we have a lot of first aid for our physical health, but we have very little first aid for emotional health. And to me, just as we hire coaches for our bodies or go for regular health checkup, we also need to maintain mental fitness. And of course, as well, another point that's linked to that is, as mental health providers or anybody who's a mental health influencer, where people are watching you and listening and learning from you, then our onus is to talk responsibly about mental health. So, like, much as there's a conversation that I really appreciate, like, Manpreet talked about, Miss B talked about, in terms of, say, people are starting to talk about this, people are learning to be vulnerable. There's also a lot of wrong information being given out. So, for instance, people might be talking about how they have a mental health issue, like the anxiety and panic, but you're still seeing the same things 5 years later. And it's almost like they're always talking about how this is going to continue forever, or there's actually explicitly written there that they're going to experience trauma for the rest of their lives. So when we see somebody who's vulnerable and they are seeing this influencer or this source of information, they're latching onto it and they're thinking of that as the truth. And so they themselves are going to learn how to grow helpless and even hopeless. So as anybody who has got a platform, our onus is really to talk responsibly. And yes, our viewpoints would change over time. They will evolve. That's great. It's not about having that same fixed viewpoint, because we grow as people and as professionals, and the field grows, not just our field in mental health, our field in physical health as well, and how everything is linked. So it's okay to allow our viewpoints to change and to be able to talk about that, rather than to be rigidly stuck in that. And of course, like the last thing that I really want to talk about here, I know I've talked a lot, is that what mental health can really do differently, not just in APAC, but in the rest of the world, is that we need to rebrand how we can shine the way we've been wired, rather than feel we are forced into a certain personality mode. And I know over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, the move towards embracing introversion has been a lot bigger, especially with Susan Cain. And as a veritable introvert, I'm so into that. But then, we also got to talk about neurodiversity. It's not just about having somebody who is wired just that way, with a medium or a long attention span. As somebody with ADHD, there's also people who have short attention span, people with more rigid ideas and the way that we see the world, because we all have our strengths. And when we can work and leverage from a place of strengths, that's when we can actually learn how to send off the rougher edges of how we are wired as well, then we can play well with everybody else.
Thank you so much. And honestly, I could listen to this for another hour. It was very interesting, and I agree with all of your points. And I was just thinking that it's been a very interesting trend in the neurodiversity space with social media about some influencers, of course, not all of them, but many pages are really highlighting how difficult it is to be neurodistinct in a neurotypical world. And I often would love to see a bit more balance of being able to validate that, yes, life can be indeed difficult, and we have a community of people who we can connect to who have a more deep lived understanding of the difficulties. At the same time, we really need to balance it out with hope and wanting to be better and do better, and wanting to live a life that is more meaningful and flourishing and is worth living and is giving us more joy, along the fact that we are also going to feel sadness and grief and difficulties and anxiety, because these are normal parts of life. So I'm all for making changes to communities so that we're not just bonding over how hard it is to be in a marginalized group, but we are bonding over the things that we can do and the unique perspectives and skills and attributes that we have that can really enable us to include mental health and neurodiversity as a massive strength for everyone involved. So thank you for that point, Perpetua. And Ms. MP, what are your thoughts on what changes are needed?
Thank you, Lutza, and thank you very much, Dr. P. I must say, the pointers that you have covered here not only encompass the outlook that I carry when it comes to mental health and looking at people in general, but also with respect to the fact that in Asia, this such a beautiful point that you brought up about boundaries, that is a huge challenge. Oh my goodness. I mean, that is something that, really people around us, we sometimes, I mean, of course, we also struggle with it. That definitely adds on to the concerns related to mental health, and then eventually to physical health and everything around us. Similarly, I would also want to add the economic factor into everything that we are discussing. Because, as someone who actually was brought up in a very, very, decent environment, in a very, I won't say decent, but I was like I have had my own personal journey through PTSD, depression, clinical depression, panic disorder, anxiety disorder, and ADHD. All of these things, along with a very frugal family with limited economic resources, I can't think of, really being able to approach a psychologist at that point in time. I mean, of course, it's been 30 years now, but then still today, especially due to pandemic, I think there's this huge polarization that we can see within the society, the ones which are affluent, and then the ones who are extremely poor. At least that's what the case is in India right now. Anybody who is able to afford mental health services, I think we can call them affluent with respect to what we are facing right now. Because the kind of environment that we are in, it's so depressing. Most of the people that I know have lost one or more family members during this 1 year. I mean, I myself have lost my father, and the kind of impact that it creates on a child. I mean, I'm such a grown up in this sense, yet I am having such a difficult time to accept that, yes, This is the reality. Now, what I'm trying to bring here is the mindset, which Dr. P also mentioned, and Dr. Lutza also talked about, is the mindset, the attitude with which we carry ourselves, the skills that we can gain. So there's this model, there's this, learning framework, which is given by National Geographic, which I actually found very helpful with respect to how I work with my clients. This is an explorer mindset, which helps us to be curious, to have knowledge, to be empowered, to be responsible, and also along the way gain skills like observation, communication, which are I think what we know on, especially on LinkedIn, is something that we as professionals are talking about, that these are the skills that we need in leaders. And these are exactly the skills, if we can develop among children, within ourselves, which could really bring a change for the better society that we are thinking about. And the kind of society that we imagine, I think, is fairly possible if, at the very least, most of us are curious about what is happening around us, from the perspective that I am also responsible in the larger context. So that's something that I think we want to share. So economic factor, yes, that's something that need to be included. How can that happen? I think it only can really be looked at, or really can be supported through developing this kind of mindset, which is like explorer mindset. That's something that I think should balance out both the factors.
Thank you, MP, and also thank you for the courage and vulnerability with which you have shared some very important and very inspirational parts of you, and you have been in my thoughts. So now for a practical takeaway, what would you suggest for people to start thinking or doing to improve their own mental health? Dr. P?
For me, it's for people to develop an emotional vocabulary of what they're experiencing. So it's not just about getting swept away in how people say, oh, therapy is just about feelings, feelings, feelings. And, we know that feelings should not cripple us. That's one thing. And the only way that we are actually swept away by feelings, feelings, feelings is actually because when we suppress these feelings. So it's really about understanding what's going on in our bodies. And even if you cannot have the word, so, like for some people, to begin with, it's neutral, positive, negative, can be a very good start, rather than they're just completely disconnected. To actually know where that is in their body, to know what thoughts are associated with that. Like with my clients, I always make them start a body map of, so they actually draw a stick figure, color it in, and basically talk about where all these feelings live in their body. And then, slowly as I start to give them things like the emotions of will, they start to get really deep into the nuances, and that's a really good thing. And then they can learn how to reset their brains, because emotional intelligence really isn't just about how well you play with others or what a good leader you are. It's really about how well you know yourself and can take care of yourself.
Absolutely. And I think especially with neurodistinct people, we know that as many as 80–90% of autistic people have alexithymia, which is difficulties reading and recognizing their own emotions. So being able to identify what is actually going on for us can really make sure that emotions are used as they were meant to, which is a signal of what is happening, which can then guide our actions. Thank you. And what about you, MP? What's your practical takeaway?
There's quite a number of things, of course. But then one, if I have to just choose one thing, that would be being able to bring awareness to what is happening within and around us. So that it is part of what Dr. P is also saying, that being able to recognize the emotions. I think this comes a little ahead of that is like just being simply aware. Sometimes the only thing that maybe you can do, especially when you know we are struggling with feelings which do not really make us feel empowered, and the kind of feelings that make us feel stuck. At that point in time, we can use breathing exercises. We can just bring our awareness back to our breath. If that's the one thing that we can do, it just changes. I mean, of course, not in one day itself, but then it changes our environment and ourselves if we can practice it as often as possible. For this, if it is, I mean, especially with neurodivergence and neurodistincts like us, remembering things is a huge challenge. I mean, being able to keep a track of what I'm doing and along with everything that we are doing, being able to be aware. I think if we can also set reminders, because we are carrying our phones and our technical stuff all the time with us, if we can set regular reminders to get back to our breath, that is something I think would really influence a person's well-being in general, and can also change the situation that they are in, so by simply being aware. Just one more thing that I would want to add, which is being able to spend time in nature. If that is a possibility, maybe if spending time in nature is not possible, maybe we can spend time with nature. We can bring nature at our home. Like, as we can see, I think, you know, Dr. P, I, and Lutza, all of us have plants at home, which is like bringing nature to our place. That is so, so important. So if that is something that all of us can do, I think it should help us be aware further. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I had a different practical takeaway in mind, but as we were speaking, I think the issue of boundaries have come up a lot. So I'd like to do a practical takeaway for that, which is basically think about yourself as though you're a house. And the metaphor of a house is that sometimes when we have boundaries that are too rigid, it's like we have a house where the fence is so high, security cameras, do not trespass, you'll be persecuted. Nobody wants to go near that house because it's so guarded and off-putting. So we want to make sure that we don't have really rigid boundaries. At the same time, it's also quite dangerous to have leaky boundaries. So if you imagine a house where there is no fence, the front door is wide open, people can go in, they can take your fridge, they can go into your bedroom, have a sleep, take a shower, eat all your food, break your aircon and then leave. That's actually not a nice house to live in. So you also want to make sure that you don't give so much with so little boundaries that you are not a comfortable space for yourself and others anymore. So really think about boundaries like a white picket fence. I guess that's quite an Australian example, but a fence that you can see, but you can also modulate. So you can come through the white picket fence, you can come into the garden, but only certain people will be allowed inside the house. And then only certain people will be invited into your kitchen. So you have to make sure that you respect your own boundaries. And when you give to the right people and the right amount so that everybody still has a comfortable space. So with that, I'd like to open it up for Q&A. Yeah, MP, go for it.
I just want to add here from the Asian perspective, from especially the South Asian perspective, here, since we are collectivist society, so it's not as individual. Yes, things are changing drastically. It's things are so clamp packed that setting boundaries as we define it, because whatever we study, I mean, even in, for that matter, what we study in India comes from the individualistic culture. So when we talk about boundaries in Asia, many a times it doesn't make sense to people, because it's like, how can I think about myself when I have my in-laws at home, because we live all of us together in many of the cases. So it's so, I would say it's so challenging. And I would just add on to what you're saying, that yes, we can develop this mindset to be able to set boundaries. That is fairly definitely possible. But I guess, Dr. P can maybe add on a little, maybe just a pointer or two to this, and how is it looked at? So how this whole boundary setup and, the society in general as a family, or maybe how is it looked at from the mental health perspective, and this practical implication of what Dr. Lutza is saying?
So I think it's quite similar over here, because people do live in bigger families, or it's what we call it more of an enmeshed system, because it's more, we think more in terms of communitarian rather than individualistic. So it's almost like boundaries are non-existent here. Sometimes people don't grow up knowing that they have permission to have boundaries, much less that they can have boundaries, or the scripts have boundaries. So it's very, yes, you have got other people coming in, breathing in into your neck, or, it could also be a very joyful, loving thing as well. So when it comes to things like that, it's really about understanding what makes you comfortable, what makes you uncomfortable. Like Lutza says, it's not just about it's about having the white picket fence. So it's not just about having an electric fence or a moat with an alligator in it. Sometimes people think of boundaries that way. So it's just about simple things like, simple little privacies. So I know that in some families, people open each other's mails. So it's about actually setting a boundary like, hey, this is something that is private and personal. So I would appreciate in the future if you do not open it. As simple as that. Or what else could be? Or when people start asking you about topics that you really don't want to talk about, but you feel like you are obliged to answer because you've always answered. And also because, as neurodiverse people, we have spent a lot of our lives trying to explain things away for people. We watch why people are the way they are. So there's a lot of things that we kind of tolerate or sweep under the carpet, or we're trying to understand what normal behavior is in order to mimic it. So we kind of think that it's okay, even though we know some things are not okay. There's something deep in our guts, even if we have alexithymia, okay? There's something deep in our guts that tell us whether something is off or something is on. And so a very normal thing, without even having to talk about professional boundaries, then is about the personal boundary when it comes to topics that we really don't want to talk about, especially when people are nosy. So one way is to say that, to change it, or to kind of deflect it, if the person will jump in and say, you're being sensitive, I'm worried about you, that's not cool. Okay, so one way is to say, hey, you know what, like, we only have this amount of time together, I would really love to spend this time talking about X, Y, Z. Or another thing you could say, especially if you get a lot of unsolicited advice, which is a problem over here as well, is to actually say, you know what, this is something I'm working on with a professional. So I would like to keep our time together about talking about things that are linked to both of us. And most people actually do get a hint. And if they don't, then that's when you step out your boundaries a step higher. And speaking of that, one great book I would totally recommend would be Terry Cole's Boundary Boss, which has been recently released. So fabulous.
Thank you. I will try to put that in the links. And this might be one for you, NP, a question. In the pandemic, in low-income areas with school closed, what are some ways to educate the general public on the topic of mental health?
I think one of the best ways is to, since internet is something which is available to most of us, that's one channel through which, maybe, there are professionals like us who are doing YouTube lives, and, there are channels that they could, credible sources, if they can follow that. But then again, because they are low income schools, the language that they, their first language most probably would be either regional, mother tongue, or Hindi. So in that case, finding credible resources is again a challenge. I still don't think that it is still as accessible to low income schools, and to, especially that's the point that I think I mentioned in my, conversation earlier, that what needs to change is we also need to take into account the economic factors. Now, how we can do it, I think we are still struggling with this whole idea of how to be able to provide access to quality mental health services to as many of us as we can. That's I think. I'm so sorry, there's no concrete answer as I have as of now. But I will look into it, and then I can get back to you. Pashmina. No, sorry. Pashmeen. Sorry. Yeah.
Any other questions for either of us? Yes.
Lutza, I would really like to hear, and I think all of us would like to hear about your first step that you had planned to share, which was mental health literacy, because I think that will encompass with what Dr. P and I are also trying to say when it comes to boundaries, because there are so many things when it comes to especially Asian culture. It's like honor, shame, fear. These are like basic emotions. Maybe we won't even identify while we are going through them. So having this, I think being able to be literate with mental health concerns or mental health in general could really influence, and maybe could also answer Pashmeen's question, and how can we make it accessible to even poor communities. If we can do it today, would be great. If we cannot, I think I would love to still maybe we can have another discussion.
Yeah, I think just being mindful of the time, it would be fantastic to have another discussion, because a lot of it is really quite simple stuff that often people take for granted and dismiss their importance. So for example, being able to translate our physical signs and our emotional signs into what's happening and what our feelings and thoughts tell us about our values and directions of where we need to go, and our difficulties that make it difficult to get where we want to go. Sorry, I'm just trying to organize my thoughts. So basically with mental health literacy, a lot of it is getting to know yourself, and I guess in my framework or suggestion, getting to know how your three bodies are working. So what are your physical signs, your inner signs, and what is the natural way that you're expressing yourself? Because often people think that if we see a certain facial expression, like somebody looks bored, we often assume that they are actually bored because this is what we might look like when we are bored. But that bored person, supposedly bored person, may be incredibly anxious. They may be zoned out. In my case, often when I look bored, my thoughts are going so fast that I just can't look at something. So when I look vacant, I'm actually the most switched on. So you will not be able to know how another person is necessarily feeling and thinking just by looking at them, unless you have a bit of a dictionary to them, a bit of a user guide. And that's something that is the first step of being able to compile for yourself, just like Dr. P was saying. So get in touch with, how do you know what's going on for you? And what does it mean? The things that are going on for you, what does it mean? How can you use them? And once you know that, and you can have another person's perspective. So sometimes we actually have massive blind spots, and it can be very useful for people to say that, oh, actually, I noticed that when you say this or do that, it's very different what's going on for you. I have a bit of a funny example of a friend of mine who contacted me months and months ago, and she said, oh, how have you been? And I was like, oh, I'm absolutely dying. And she was like, oh, thank God, I thought something was wrong. I'm like, what do you mean, thank God? I'm telling you that I'm absolutely dying. And she's like, yeah, but when you're okay, you're dramatic, and absolutely dying means I'm slightly inconvenienced by something. I worry when I don't hear from you, because when you say, I'm okay, things are fine, that's when I know that something is very, very wrong. So this was an interesting thing for her to point out, because I wasn't aware of that, but she was absolutely right. So mental health literacy is being able to build this dictionary to yourself and to other people to really understand how we really are in the world and what different things mean to us, even if it's very different from what the very same thing would mean to another person. So I'm just mindful of our time. I would like to thank you, Dr. P and MP as well, for the amazing panel that we have had. We will aim to share it on the NDGiFTS YouTube channel as part of the monthly meetings, so that other people who were unable to join us today can hopefully tune in as well. I'm happy to hang back for another 15 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, comments, I'm just gonna stop the recording and I'm here to listen. Otherwise, thank you so much everybody for attending, and I hope to see you all next month.